everybody, and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well, and today I'll be doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, still a mouthful, open up and set apparently a franchise 5-day US opening record of $80 million. Oh, Tony, even though this is a movie I really like, I hate whenever you do that kind of nonsense because we all know Tony loves to ignore inflation, also loves to ignore the fact that ticket prices have changed over time. You gotta choose at least one of those to have an actual good metric of where this movie stands in comparison to those other films, but don't worry, we will go through the numbers, we will go through where this film stands, especially in comparison to the opening weekends of the previous franchises, and also, we'll talk a little bit about where Tony is when it comes to Sound of Freedom, which, let's just be frank here, even though Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 has a solid opening here, and despite what anyone might try to say, this is a solid opening. And I'll explain why that is a fact in just a few minutes, but even more so than that film, even more impressive than Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, no doubt whatsoever, has to be right now the box office for Sound of Freedom. Not only did Sound of Freedom come in the number 2 spot this weekend, beating out what many had suspected in Hollywood at the very least coming in at number 2, which would be Insidious, The Red Door, right, the 5th film and the 5th installment of the Insidious franchise. We also see this film continuing to beat out mainstream Hollywood stays that have been out as long, or in certain cases, only about a week before said movie, a week before Sound of Freedom, which still, in any other year, if the film actually was any good, looking at you, Indiana Jones, Dial of Destiny, if you were any good, you would actually probably be still getting that number 2 spot, but because the movie sucks, it's not doing much of anything, and so we'll talk about that and a bunch of other stuff. Before going further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, that 5 button, honestly, and smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every video or live stream goes live on the channel. So Tony over at Deadline, he's probably having a bit of an aneurysm right now because he is failing to understand. He is failing to understand the fact that this movie, Dead Reckoning Part 1, is doing very well. He's kind of overselling it a little bit, but he doesn't need to. If he actually were to break down the objective numbers, you would be able to talk about how this film is doing just fine. Really, that's right where we are right now. This film is not an amazing moneymaker. This film is not a huge box office success story at this point in time. But also, these are the kinds of movies that you don't get that opening weekend that is similar to, for instance, our Doctor Strange 2 last year, which had a $450 million opening weekend. But when you do compare this film to other movies that are around the same category as far as films that have a very decent opening weekend, I would say, again, a solid opening weekend, but then also have tremendous holds because the word of mouth on it is so palpable and is so strong. Looking at you, films like, I was going to say Despicable Me, and I think I said that in the Gigs and Hammers video, but Minions Rise of Gru, right? $220 million opening weekend last year, made well over $900 million when everything was said and done. Or like last year's Top Gun Maverick, where that film opened to $250 million and made well over $1 billion, made $1.5 billion. So if you're looking at the 220, right, or rather, sorry, the 230 or so that has been made so far, is projected to have been made so far in the opening for this movie in Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and then compare that to the $250 million opening for Top Gun Maverick, it's not too far off the beaten path, right? So even if the film did percentage-wise come in, that same percentage underneath came in percentage-wise at the same level underneath where Top Gun Maverick opening was, you would still see this film make $1 billion. So what it is to say is that this film is not guaranteed to be a $1 billion movie. This movie is not guaranteed to do much of anything except, hey, this movie, all we can say so far is doing well. That week 2 drop-off, though, does become that much more important because if this film has a catastrophic drop-off, then the discussion starts to change. But if we start to see, I don't think we're going to see the teens and 20s percentage drop-off that we saw last year with Maverick, as this film is going to have a lot of competition next weekend. But I do think that we could still see this film get in that 50% or lower range. And if that happens and it continues to perform well internationally, then, hey, the chance of this film not only making money, which I think is still a guarantee based off of, again, just again, looking at these numbers, comparing it to the history of the franchise, it just does not seem there are any indications that this movie is not going to do that well. And again, we'll talk about why that is the case further as we get it further along, but it is still doing well. But regardless of any of that, and again, Tony is going to continue to try to push this in a way that I think is still being disingenuous. Again, we could talk about how well this film is doing. However, if you're going to push it in the way that you are, I don't think that you are doing a fair job at it. He goes on to say that Paramount is saying that they made around $235 million. Again, we'll find the actuals out either Monday or Tuesday of this week. But Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny, he wants to remind everybody, only opened to $130 million. The reason why that is disingenuous is because he fails to, in that same sentence, add on, even though Dial of Destiny had a much worse word of mouth right, had a much worse rating from audiences and from those who had actually seen the movie. And the reason why is because this is a guy that relies so heavily on things like CinemaScore and relies so heavily on sites like Rotten Tomatoes that he just does not see the forest for the trees. He's just not able to move outside of his box to be able to actually look at it in the same way. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that about Tony because everyone loves when I talk about Tony, it seems. The one thing I will also point out is, again, shame on you, Tony, because you know how he has spent all this ink, right? He has spent all this time typing out just tons of nonsense trying to explain how a film is doing really well or how a film is doing really poor on so many other films. Almost every article, if you go back, if you're in the second weekend of a movie, you typically have a pretty decent amount, especially if the film, let alone if the film's doing really, really well. Right, you have a lot of ink spent. What has he done so far when it comes to Sound of Freedom? He has tried to explain, oh, this is a conservative-backed movie. This is a right-wing extremist-type movie, etc., right? Just perpetuating the same lies that all these people in Hollywood have been trying to push about this movie. And yet he also still spends the time, for instance, in the opening weekend, or the number 2 movie of last week, a newer film that came out last week that is doing terribly at this point in time, called Joyride. Yeah, guess what? He spent a lot more time talking about that movie in the number 2 spot than he has so far talking about this movie, Sound of Freedom. This is all he says about Sound of Freedom. And you know what's amazing about Sound of Freedom and why it deserves a lot more time and attention? It got a $27 million second weekend number. And look at that week 1 to week 2 drop. It didn't drop at all, in fact. It went up 37%. Not up 15%, not up 10%, not up 5%. It went up 37%. Is reached $85 million domestically, which means this film will easily cross $100 million probably by the end of this week, if not before. And now we're talking about this movie possibly being able to give a film like Dial of Destiny a run for its money, with the fact that this movie is still making quite a bit of money and quite a bit more per theater than Dial of Destiny could ever hope to be able to achieve at this point in time. So anyway, let's go ahead and continue to dive into it. My computer screen went black for a second. I don't know exactly what happened. Hopefully the video is still recording and nothing else happened on y'all's end, but we'll have to wait and see. Again, we love doing this stuff live here on the channel. But again, shout out to Sound of Freedom. That is, I think, the real big story of this box office weekend, is how impressive this movie actually is. Again, a 37% increase from a second weekend, and you increased about 300 screens, and this movie has been lambasted in all mainstream media outlets. What does that tell us? It tells us that people are no longer listening to the garbage mainstream media, and instead are finding out the actual facts and truth about given things without having to take someone's word for it, but actually be able to look up the information for themselves. And again, kudos to them for being able to do as well as they are. Also, want to give a shout out to Nance, because, hey, Nancy, I was able to find it. Look at that. It's under the box office section. I don't know where you've been hiding your articles, right? You've had articles that have been late in their release. You've had other articles that have been hiding other under tabs that, even though you're clearly talking box office, you put it under a different tab. I don't quite understand that, but hey, Nance is back, and as you can see here, $235 million global opening for this movie. And as I said, this still is doing very, very well. Again, it's not doing exceptionally well, but this film is still, in comparison to the others in the franchise and also other films that we can look and again give examples of, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago and a few minutes earlier, this movie's doing just fine and likely will still be able to make quite a bit of money. We'll talk about that a little further when we get into the by the numbers stuff. But anyway, let's go ahead and look at the domestic opening. As you can see over at the numbers, we have Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 making $56.2 million in its 3-day opening. Now, here is a major factor, right? Some people say, ooh, $56 million, that's a far cry from the numbers that were being projected. Remember, the numbers were saying that it would have gotten to around, $100+ million, right? $90 million by Sunday, and then over $100 million. Again, the original numbers were around 90 to 100 million by the end of today. Well, here is the problem, though. How many other movies do we have on record that a 5-day opening, right, where it released earlier than the typical frame, that was not a holiday frame? Remember, this movie opened last Monday, in some places even last Sunday, right, domestically. That is a very weird schedule. That is not common. Most films don't fall into that. In fact, I can't think of one off the top of my head that has a similar metric. Again, a non-holiday frame specifically. And so with that taken into account, that 56.2 million 3-day, so that's the Friday to Sunday numbers, not including the Thursday or not including the Wednesday or the Tuesday or the Monday, etc. What that means then is, okay, let's compare the 3-day specifically to other films in the franchise. And guess what? Most of the other films in the franchise made around, again, over the past few years, I should say, right, the last few, where the franchise really started to take off, made, right, only really about maybe 10 million or so more. We're talking about films that were in the $60 million range or so. In fact, let's go ahead. We love to do stuff live here over at OMB Reviews. So let's go ahead and see if I can pull up this. I actually got this ready for a show earlier and ended up not being able to do it because of, just, again, busyness going on at home. But just to give you a bit of a comparison, all right? So the $54 million, and it actually came in over where they had, again, originally expected this to be. So coming in, they're saying at 56.2. Right, I had this film at 54.2. So let's go ahead and just put that in for a second just to give a frame of reference. So this is just the 3 days, all right? This is just the domestic openings compared. So if you look at all of these films in the Mission Impossible franchise, all right, the only film that makes less than this, the only film that sold less tickets overall was Ghost Protocol. Now, Ghost Protocol only opened for a week in about 300 screens, a very limited run, which explains why its opening was listed as 17.6. That went on still to make quite a bit of money. Again, very, very impressive stuff there. But let's go ahead and just compare that then to the other films in the franchise. When you adjust for inflation, the other films in the franchise over the last few years, right, the last few, right, Fallout, Rogue Nation, let's focus on those, 74 million versus 72 million. So roughly 6.5 to 6.7 million tickets. Now, just the 3-day numbers here, right? Remember that this film is now at about $80 million or so. Let's go ahead and pull those numbers back up. We talk here about the domestic numbers for a moment. Yeah, so about $80 million is where this film currently is as far as its overall numbers. So it looks like that's probably what the numbers has not updated on this chart, is that this still has it at 61, whereas here it is set to be 80 million. So $80 million is what it's made so far through Sunday. Because of that, right, if we make a similar comparison to those other numbers that we've seen, okay, that would, again, put that right up there, right? Even when you adjust for inflation, that puts it right up there. That would also mean that, let's go ahead and just as a frame of reference, take into account the fact that we have seen an increase in ticket prices as well, right? This takes into account a $13 ticket price average. Guess what? Look what you have there, all right? You are basically seeing a very, very similar number of people, the same number of people, roughly the same number of people who saw the opening weekend for Rogue Nation and Fallout domestically have now also shown up for this movie. And again, a lot of people were very, very confused about how this film had its release. What this is meant to show you, though, is that the numbers are not that drastically different when you actually compare apples to apples, when you actually are looking at the data as it is coming in. Because again, I know some people might say, but you're counting the 5-day total and you have to compare the other 5-day totals to it. But again, this is a very weird release. It's a very unique and interesting release. And even based on these numbers, and there very well could be a small mistake because, again, they're recording this video. These are the numbers that I have available to me. What this is showing is that the movie is doing just fine. All right, it's doing just fine. We're actually not seeing numbers of tickets sold domestically compared to what the first two Mission Impossible films did. Those actually had around 10 million tickets sold, if you look at the average ticket price and what the overall domestic opening weekends were. And so we're still a far cry from that because movie-going habits have changed quite a bit, especially over the last few years. But in comparison to other similar time frame, again, 2018, 2015, even many people look at those and say that's kind of outdated. Guess what? If you have to take those into account, you are seeing this movie doing just fine. Now, if you're going to try and say, but they were projecting this, yes, then you would be correct. Because if you're going to take into account that they were originally projecting the film to make 250 million worldwide and it only made 236, that is less. But also remember, those are people making projections. Those are people making guesses. And guess what? There are not a lot of metrics we can look to, especially over the more recent time in cinema history, where you have 5-day openings as a weird release schedule as you have for this movie. You just don't have it, right? Someone might be able to pull up and drudge up an example, right, to be like, oh, well, actually, if you look at this movie, the point of it is, though, is that there's not nearly enough data to make any type of accurate projections on, right? The reason why so many of these people are able to make projections, whether they be completely accurate, which they are most of the time, or completely inaccurate, as in the case was for Super Mario Brothers movie, a lot of it is because they are basing it off of historical standards, right? Historical information and historical data. We don't have a lot of data as far as a initial release for this movie. What we do have, though, is, hey, what is the opening weekend comparison to other films? Okay, we do have that data and we can look at it, and that lets us have a much better understanding. And when you look at the fact that this movie has made around $236 million, and again, the numbers has not updated, it looks like it is the domestic chart there, which would bring it up to 236, then what you are looking at is a situation where this movie is doing about as well as could be expected. And that week 2 drop-off is going to be crucial that's going to tell us quite a bit of information about where this film falls in the long run. And so be tuned and stay tuned for the box office breakdown next weekend, because that will tell us a lot more as far as the overall chances are for this movie. As I said in the beginning, though, Sound of Freedom is the most impressive. It added 300 screens, is making $8,000 per screen, which is twice the amount of Red Door, more than twice the amount of Dial of Destiny. Again, 3 times the amount that we see. Again, a lot more than that for compared to Elemental in its first 5 weeks, and if you have to go a lot further down to even get close to the per theater ratio for a movie like The Flash. But again, Sound of Freedom has had everything against it. Everyone's trying to paint this picture in a certain way so that people don't go to see it, which is kind of insane to think about, right? Why would anyone want to paint this movie in any way that keeps people from seeing it? This is the kind of movie that needs to be supported, that needs to be watched, because there are so many people that do not know the reality of human trafficking, that do not know the reality of children impacted by human trafficking, and that is putting it in the most polite of terms. And so this is the kind of movie that needs exposure, that deserves exposure, because it also happens to be well made, and this movie is just rocking the box office right now. If you, again, take into account all those factors, that per theater ratio is amazing. So again, kudos to Angel Studios for distributing this movie when people like 20th Century Fox and especially Disney refused. Disney especially had this movie for a year before it did anything with it. Shame on you. It tells us a lot also about you, Disney, and the fact that Bob Iger had the gall to come out and try to say that, oh, our company's not doing anything that negatively impacts children. Oh, really? Oh, really, Bob? I got news for you, brother. Anyway, we also have Insidious Red Door dropping 61%. This is very similar. Again, this is a very common thing we see with these horror films, right? They have a pretty decent opening weekend, pretty massive drop-off, but hey, it's already made its money back, adding nonstop, or just, again, continuing to add to its overall profits. Dial of Destiny dropped another 56% from last weekend, so this film is continuing to be a massive flop. It looks like Disney is starting to abandon this movie. In fact, 735 screens have been pulled for this movie after the first 3 weeks. It's very uncommon that Disney does this kind of pulling from screens. However, it's been a lot more common recently because they've had a lot of box office bumps. Elemental is doing much better than what the initial 2 weeks had told us, right? 13% hold after 5 weeks. This is probably one of the better performing Disney films, and yet it is still not going to make any money. Very similar to Little Mermaid. Also did better compared to its first 2 weeks. However, because the amount of money they've been spending on it, and that's just what we are assuming it spent, because we all know what happened with Doctor Strange 2. We just found out that they actually spent well over $100+ million more than what had been originally expected, meaning not only do you have potentials for these massive flops that are already flops, these flops could actually end up getting much larger when we know these official numbers coming out of next year. Any of these movies that had any association or any filming or main production in the UK, we will be able to find out that information around the same time next year. And I cannot wait to find out how much they actually spent on these movies. Spider-Verse going to the number 6 movie there, $368 million. This film is still set to probably get to $700 million. Even though it has been out for 7 weeks, it's slowing down quite a bit. Hey, after 7 weeks, it's still making $6 million, seeing very strong hold. So I think this film still has a lot left in the tank. Probably can get to well north of 700 to 750 million is probably where this film will end up when all is said and done. Rise of the Beast is also doing much better than what the first 2 weeks insinuated, but again, not enough to be able to make up its money because this film cost just way too much. Paramount wasting money there. No Hard Feelings, also from Sony. It's, again, I've heard some people say, well, it's going to do much better on streaming and much better on demand. That might be the case. However, all I have is the box office data to go off of, and this movie is essentially a box office flop. Joyride, in its second weekend, has dropped 56%. We still have no budget. Lionsgate, whoever else made this movie, why don't we have a budget yet for this movie? Because this film, based on that and based off of the typical spending on movies like this, looking like it's going to be a box office flop. Little Mermaid coming to the number 10 spot. Again, still holding 36% there after 8 weeks of release. However, the fact that this movie is still likely not going to make, and again, this film is absolutely not going to make any money for Disney, is, I think, very well worth it. Also, The Flash is not even close to that. Top 10 is now number 13 after 5 weeks of release. They've also bled another 900+ screens. Warner Brothers giving up on this film completely. Something tells me they're trying to make room for Barbie. A lot of speculation is that Barbie's going to be this huge, massive hit. That very well could be the case. We'll find out the information the closer that we get to it. But if any of the information coming from the interviews about any political motivations with that film are concerned, you might see a strong opening weekend. But if any of that political stuff is in there, guess what? you're going to lose a lot of people in the audience if that is actually the case. Looking internationally for a second, again, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning has made $236 million worldwide. These numbers have not been updated from thenumbers.com, but if you compare this to Minions Rise of Gru from last year, 220, even if you adjust for inflation, it would put it right around the same amount of money, or compared to the $250 million it made last year by Top Gun Maverick. This film is right up there as a opening weekend that is not outside the realm of possibility of not only making $1 billion, but making more. Top Gun Maverick, remember, opened at $250 million, made $1.5 billion when everything was said and done. Also, Dead Reckoning Part 1 and the entire Mission Impossible franchise has always been, especially more recently, a universal international franchise. In fact, every film from the past few years from the Mission Impossible franchise has made about 2.5 or so times the amount of money that the domestic market was. So if this movie still has a decent domestic performance, right now it's doing okay, it's doing fine, it's doing exactly what it needs to, and has a similar and again, right now, look, you have 80 to 155 million, so about almost double internationally at this point. It still has to release in Japan. However, it is getting released up against a Miyazaki movie, the new Miyazaki movie, so I don't think it's going to do huge numbers in Japan, but hey, I've been wrong in Japan before. It very well could still happen. The fact, though, is this film is still doing very well, and it would not surprise me to see this film actually end up getting closer to the 500+ million that was made at the same time of release as Top Gun Maverick and other films like it. Sound of Freedom, $85 million domestic. I've heard that this might be getting international release in certain markets. This film is just a massive win. Angel Studios, again, picked this movie up. I think they only spent about maybe $5 million to get the distribution rights for this movie from Disney, and so the fact that they got such a steal, they're making massive profits on this movie, and they've already apparently greenlit the idea of moving forward with a follow-up, right? So continuing to dive further into Tim Ballard's story, which I think is phenomenal. I can't wait to see what they do with this, and again, the amount of money I imagine that's going to be coming from this movie to support organizations that work with trying to help kids, not just the end of trafficking, but also the helping of kids post-trafficking is such an important thing and mission to support. So screw Hollywood for what they've tried to do to this movie. Citizen Red Door, again, massive profits for that film. Indiana Jones, still a massive loss. So I saw one thumbnail or title of a video saying the film wouldn't go past $300 million. I don't know why anyone would say that. Again, based on the numbers that we had, this movie is past $300 million at this point in time, and I still think has a little bit of gas left in the tank. We're looking at probably a closer end of this movie to be somewhere between $350 and $400 million. The fact, though, is because this film cost a minimum, and again, a minimum of $350 million, and it could very well have been a lot higher than that, that means that this movie is going to just, again, be a massive, massive flop. And again, couldn't happen to a nicer studio there. Elemental, not nearly as bad performance-wise. Overall, again, looking at the percentages there as to what this film could have been, but because of how much they spent on it, it is a flop. Spider-Verse continuing to add to its overall profits. I think again, $700 million, I think is definitely on track. Transformers Rise of the Beast is a flop, though again, not by as much as I originally thought. No Hard Feelings, also a flop. Joyride, no budget, but can probably guess that it's a flop. Little Mermaid, also a flop. So again, you have a lot of flops coming out this year. Ruby Gillman, the only thing saving this film, or as far as the studio behind it is concerned, from DreamWorks, the only thing saving them is the fact that apparently, again, shout out to Valiant Renegade, he reported that Netflix had apparently already funded this movie, and so therefore they've made their money back from just Netflix alone, spending the money on actually making it, and so therefore, because of that, that means that the losses that you would typically see from a studio are not actually going to be had by this. However, we could say, at least on paper, this film is also flopping to a massive degree. No one's seeing this movie, and that's not to say the film is good or bad, but I know I just still have no interest in actually going to see it. Flash is probably going to end up struggling to get to $300 million, especially with it being abandoned. I would say $300 million isn't a possibility at this point, but again, another massive financial loss, but I don't think it's bad. I think Indiana Jones, because even though this final number will probably get closer to 350 to 400 million, and you have another film in The Flash probably not getting to 300, the fact that Indiana Jones still costs so much more than what The Flash did ultimately is going to, I think, make this the biggest flop of the year. But can't wait to find out the official numbers next year. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, $840 million. $850 is still on the table, but definitely not nearly as likely as it could have been. Doing some box office projections and looking at the charts, because I love looking at the charts here over at OMB Reviews. I can see with Insidious The Red Doors, $122 million. It's two weekend total. I'm projecting right now the film to get somewhere between 175 and 245 by the end of its run. Film's already been profitable, so you're probably seeing this film going to end around $100 million in net gain profit if you use the typical standards that I use. And so therefore, again, shows that if you spend $16 million on a movie, right? If you spend a very little amount on a horror film that has an established franchise, guess what? Even if the film is bad, and I'm not saying that it is, but let's say it was terrible, the chances of you making your money back is still very, very high. So kudos to them for being able to put that out there. We already did the breakdown last weekend of Ruby Gillman, and we can't do an official breakdown of Sound of Freedom or Joyride, we can do an official estimate for Joyride, having made 2 weeks, after 2 weeks, 10.9 million. It means it'll get somewhere between 15 and 21. Again, no budget yet being reported, though, so I can't say what the actual losses are on the movie. However, again, it is something I imagine, based on how much these films typically cost, I would imagine somewhere in the $15 to $20 million range, as these smaller films for these major studios tend to cost that much. And if that is the case, then that would mean this film is going to be a guaranteed financial flop and failure. But what we can say is a success is Sound of Freedom. Now, remember, the budget I'm putting in here is the original production budget, which is around $14.5 million, but this film was made 5 years ago, so I do have it rounded up to 15 to be fair. And that means the break even in typical standards would be 37.5. But the fact that Angel Studios only spent about $5 million to get it, their profits are actually a lot higher than what's being instigated here. Because I don't have a special category for these movies, because it's very rare that the kinds of movies that we see in the case of Sound of Freedom happen. That's the reason why I would just rather keep everything the way that I always do these trackings, and then just add that in as a bit of audio commentary. So Sound of Freedom, though, with $85 million so far, and again, only $5 million really being spent by Angel Studios. This is nothing but a huge win for that studio and for that company. And again, shout out to them for making a successful movie. Over 5.7 times the original budget. And if you especially compare that number of compared to original budget, and then you take into account that it's actually smaller because of the $5 million that was spent, that then puts to shame the vast majority of movies that have come out from modern Hollywood. Even films that have done pretty well, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, for instance, 3.4 times its budget, that still puts to shame what this movie has been able to do, right? It puts to shame Disney, it puts to shame Warner Brothers and all these other studios. It will probably end up putting to shame also Dead Reckoning Part 1. Even the film does incredibly well, as I suspect that it will, especially over the course of its release. This film is still putting to shame all of those other releases. Going further into it, as you can see, Indiana Jones is still a massive failure. And again, this is using the original $300 million production budget that was given. Right now, there's actually been updates to say, again, from official sources, that it was closer to $350 to $400 million. And even that is still not taking into account what they likely spent on this movie. So even though this number, right, it doesn't seem as bad as it once was, that's still really, 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 really bad. Especially when you take into account that Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny 302 with Mission Impossible after 1 week at 235, yeah, this movie is going to easily pass. It's going to destroy the box office, not only for Dial of Destiny, but also for Elemental, also for The Flash. It's almost at the point of passing The Flash. Probably in the next couple of days, it will pass that, in fact. And so, again, very impressive numbers there. Those are numbers as they stand, though. Let me know your thoughts about any of the films I mentioned. Also, do you think Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, still a massive title, is going to make its money back and is going to possibly break $1 billion? I think that making its money back, I do think it's going to happen. I know that this film definitely costs a lot more in comparison to the other films in the franchise, but if you actually do compare it, especially when you take into account inflation, the most expensive film in the entire franchise was actually Mission Impossible 3. J.J. Abrams, not a surprise there. $230 million was the adjusted for inflation numbers there. And so it cost another $60 million, Part 1 of Dead Reckoning, right? And so, yes, that's quite a bit more, but it's also not nearly as much more as you would think, right? $100 million is a lot more. Like $60 million, it's a lot, but not nearly as much as $100 million, right? I'm using the comparison of Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness costing $100 million more than what had been originally thought. So if I look at these numbers here, and I look at where these numbers are currently tracking, even though, right, we can absolutely see higher opening weekends. Again, the standard for most of the Mission Impossible films has been around $70 million or so, right? $73 million was Mission Impossible 3's opening weekend. $72 was Rogue Nation. $74 was Fallout. Remember that Ghost Protocol had a weird release, and it made 17.6. So why aren't we going to give a lot of people, whenever I mention Ghost Protocol, they'll say, well, that film had a very limited release, and so therefore it got impacted. And again, we all accept that as the truth. Why is it that certain people are still dragging their feet to say that, hey, the weird release schedule for Dead Reckoning is impacting the numbers as we currently see them? And so therefore, to say that this film is doing terrible, especially historically, is just not accurate. It is factually inaccurate. Now, again, I'm not saying this movie is guaranteed to make money, it's guaranteed to make $1 billion. Weekend 2 will tell us that, because that'll actually give us the, okay, are people going to see this multiple times? Is this film going to do well in the face of competition up against Oppenheimer and up against Barbie? And then also, again, is the general feel of this movie as overall positive? Is that actually going to be holding? But again, we have to actually have that data in front of us. And as of right now, the data that we do have does suggest this movie is doing just fine. And in all likelihood, especially when you compare it to the other films that have been similar to this one, especially with the positive reactions, Top Gun Maverick, and also Minions Rise of Gru, I think the chances of this film making $1 billion are still very, very high. They're not guaranteed. But let me know your thoughts about that also in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash the like button, like the fire button, also smash the rumble button. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a special shout out to all of my members at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above, starting off first with my members over on Patreon: Father Luca Illich, Hymir Irie Hymason, Garrett Searles, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Orange Hat Reviews, check out his YouTube channel by the same name, Laura, the Monomator General's Story, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name as well. To my subscribe star peeps, Zion Voders, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name, Fast Reaction, The R, Mr. Roy, J-Rod, The Beer Guru, and ZK Man, who you can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. And lastly, to my locals members, Miss Minnesota Hockey Fan, How About a Hockey Player, J.H. Schwalbach, and Robert Barnes, the amazing lawyer. So thank y'all very much for being my supporters at the Keep of the Bifrost level and above. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, go ahead and check out that top link in the video description below to find out ways to sign up to support the channel and to be able to get access to things like the shoutouts, but also to giveaways. I have an exclusive giveaways channel on my Discord server where I give away 4Ks, Blu-rays, all kinds of stuff, and also access to an exclusive podcast that I do once or twice a month, depending on what I'm able to get accomplished, especially over the course of this crazy, crazy busy summer. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.